Beginning this next part of the this lesson, I wanted to elaborate on some things. I actually went back and listened to the previous video, and there were some points and things I wanted to highlight that I'd neglected in the previous one. But the first point I wanted to make was about the angels. It's important to note that the word angelos is actually, it comes from Greek, ancient Greek, and the Gnostics were masters of language. They understood the way all this works because they studied the Hermetic mysteries and went back to Egypt and studied the Canaanite and Babylonian mysteries to know that they were talking about energies and archetypes, energetic forces that permeate and exist within all things. So we just play them out here in the material world. But angelos actually means messenger. And when you understand what light is, it's just the conveyance of information. Like electricity is moving information. It's when something is, when light is traveling that way, it's because it's carrying information. It's moving an intent somewhere, and that's what we study through the Zodiac. Now, electricity is interesting because from its source, El, it refers to an actual bending of the light or an angle. An angular focus of the light, which changes its nature. Because when it's restricted, it has to engage new work it has to engage in work, additional work, to continue forward with its path. So changing the angle of light will actually cause it to intensify or even weaken, and especially when it comes in contact with other rays of light. So, from the letter L, and there's more to go into with that, and I'll reserve that for the mystery schools. But you can find out information about that from people like Santos Bonacci. There's some people who really go into like the phonetics of the language and how important it is to study the language and what the ancients knew about it, because we are in desperate need of a redrafting of our language. Our understanding of the way things work needs to be expressed through our language, and the way our language actually works, it deconstructs things as opposed to unify them. So it creates a separation mentality, and that's important because with our current understanding, our command of the language, it changes. It influences the way we think of the universe, and it sort of acts as a barrier in a sense that prevents us from really understanding what's happening because of the way that our line of thinking follows to explain it or to understand it. So I don't want to go into that too much right now, but about El, you get electricity, you get elements, you get the Elohim. El is of electricity from, the photon's aggressive, creative, destructive nature. It's the masculine aspect of its capability. We get electricity from it. Angels or angelos are messengers of the light. They carry it about to perform work with it. This is the work of like voltage, current. All things being made of electricity, we form relationships through it, even based on the energetic qualities we hold ourselves in opposition to, or by our perspective, those we consider to be in opposition to our own, actually creates a current of electricity or magnetism that draws the attention of the two polar opposites together. And I think I covered that significantly in the previous one. But the qualities, we love, but we see separate from ourselves, draw us toward one another passionately. This is a form of magnetism. The opposite of those beloved qualities we reject from ourselves, but are still drawn toward with like an invasive intent to engage it and to fill it with our understanding and our awareness and our judgment of it. It's the judgment bolt. And it's summoned by where polarity is greatest. It's like the tendency for light to move into darkness, or the tendency for water to move toward dryness, or the tendency for heat to travel to where there is more moisture, more humidity. And if the friction or division between the poles is great enough, we see unseen forces, wickedness, darkness, inverted values, resistance, rebelliousness. We call that the devil, the heat of it, the conflict that it creates. It's the heat of the devil. It's also a function of Aries, which is essentially fire, representing potential, or the explosive potential of, the photon, which I'll go into at another time during the actual Aries presentation. But so the qualities we keep for ourselves, we harmonize with around others who broadcast the same signals. This is like siblinghood. This would be electricity in a state of neutrality, or electrical current in a state of neutrality, which is, it's technically not moving. There's neutrality, which means it's found its ground. It isn't seeking to complete the distance, to reconcile the difference between poles. So it is neutral. It is in a state of harmony, and that can take many forms. So the elements, what are the elements? The elements are simply an expression of pressurized matter releasing its heat. Where there's heat, there's pressure. Heat's one of the first children of the atom, which leads me to wonder if, Cain in the Bible was some sort of representation of heat, or like a function of it. Cain and Abel could have been red and blue, hot and cold. But they contained all that sort of stuff allegorically with these characters in the Bible. So heat naturally decays as a function of friction. There's a cycle to it. While it's being induced, there is a rise of heat. When it's no longer being induced, there is a lapse of heat, a decay of it. As it decays, it influences molecules differently. It influences matter differently. In our atmosphere, we have gas that changes state depending on how much heat it retains. So when you heat water, like a liquid, it turns to gas, air, right? When you freeze it, it crystallizes. It's a form of earth. You get minerals from crystallization. That is matter in a dense state. When you ignite oxygen, you get fire, which is plasma, or gas, whose light and state of flux are it's releasing of ions and the leaping electrons. That's what gives us the friction and the light that we see. But all four states are the result of a change in heat, or their passion, in a sense, if you could look at it allegorically or symbolically. From the photon's perspective, it's all the same. The result of a change in heat or a passion, like the change in vibration of their atomic form. In astrology, we're viewing the sine wave of an angle of moving force as the traveling perspective of the self-aware photon. As it takes on torsion due to friction, when it meets resistance, creates light, heat, changes the energetic state as it releases its potential through the form it's engaging, which is the resistance, which is what causes the resistance. This is the math of the living matrix. This fourfold state gives us the four movements of matter, and it's always logical. So its logic is what actually gives us quadruplicity, essentially. Remember that all creative potential of the photon is what is accepted as true by it, which is why shadows are just as true. Shadows are true as we live in a place where there is the division of principles for the evolution. So quadruplicity is the fourfold nature of any living form to utilize its potential to maintain a form of homeostasis. All quadruplicity is connected. It's all the same thing. It's primordial. It's just a fourfold state of something. So elements correlate to actions, thoughts, emotions, forms. Action is, because they're all expressions of literally what matter is doing while it carries through with the force that it is transmuting through a form. It's creating all this for the experience of viewing it so that it can evolve and engage itself through matter. So giving us the basics of math, fire, for instance, or plasma is division. It's masculine and a sort of like a strong force, or it refers to force. It is matter adhering to a principle that holds that everything is true, everything that is true resonates into motion according to its resistance to passion, time, or change. It imposes division between lightness and denseness of form. Consider fission, flux, war, excitement, action, passion, conflict. These are qualities of an assertive force. It's likened to the spirit or energetic potential of an individual to accomplish work. So it's likened to electrical force. Passion, or rather, electrical force translates through us through the work that we engage something with. It's all the same archetypally. Passion drives two people together either violently by war or gently by love. Passion represents the desire or urge to get things done. That's fire. Then you have air or gas. That correlates with subtraction. It is also masculine and sort of a weaker force, but it the axis of fire and air is sort of what gives force its potential to like become greater or lesser. So through air and fire, you get combustion, but you also get an inferno. But you also get sort of an equilibrium through like humidity will hold heat and make conditions really comfortable. So air is more like into like the weaker end of the force, or what dials the force up and down. It's matter, adhering to a principle also that holds that everything that is true can be separated by perspective. So we always refer to what it's doing. So air is the element that, or the quality that takes the shape between things for like a maximum perspective. Pardon. Moving through form, which is like water or earth, it'll take the shape of a bubble. Despite whether it contains particulates of the same matter within it, there is like an exertion of pressure from all sides until it can find a form to become one with. And that's, well, I'm sorry, to become one with, I'm reading. But it's the idea that, it contains within itself the quality of fire, and that it exerts a pressure. But fire and air are sort of, inseparable. It's the actualization of matter given motion. So by it being committed to an action, there's always something that's happening with it and observable. So with air, it scatters things as individual particles are sort of stripped of their heat by evaporative cooling. But because of its movement, it's using up the heat, but it's also used by the photon to take the space between things as a dividing force. So it accomplishes work by knowing and illustrating the difference between things. It is literally like intellect, the act of judgment. It symbolically severs things in that it takes up the space between all things. No matter where there's apparently nothing, there's always air. If there's nothing else there's air. If you're looking at it, a form of air, or even a vacuum, but it pertains to the quality of air, whether there be lack thereof. Apparently, lack thereof. So refers to judgment because it takes up the space between things. It is the vessel for communication. It is the conduit for communication. It's how matter actually moves between things so that there can be communication between them. So, it's also communication in human form. So to correlate, to like the nervous system or the vocal cords or the speech or understanding and the intellect. Let's see. It was also attributed to the gods of knowledge and information. It's the force that creates friction in the divided perspective also. It permits for, the increase of heat. Even resistance sort of in the mind, which is why the Bible calls Satan the prince of the air. It also mentions how the battle of Armageddon would take place in the air, in the mind. It's also where the elect are caught up to before the final war of polarity begins. to be changed and preserved for the next phase of things in the other side. So those are the forces, air and fire. So here are the forms. We have liquid, or water. It refers to multiplication. It's primordially feminine in that it's receptive, and because it represents soft and flowing form. As water accepts all as true in accordance with ampacity and will discriminate by resonance what is introduced by force. Water will merge truths into a single flowing form. Where there is an introduction of force or an incongruence of heat, the friction of the movement alters the atomic makeup of its contents until there is stillness through, vicissitude. It'll eventually, through the friction of it sort of balancing all things out through you introduce heat to water. It's how you cook things, how you cook ingredients, how you get it all, get all the elements, the particles of something to become equal, or to take sort of the same, to blend is the idea. So it will blend truths. It is energy in motion, a flowing motion. So it's a form. It'll achieve stillness, equilibrium, and the harmony of its contents in time until it releases its heat. You'll notice, well, as long as it has heat, it'll continue to accomplish this. But you'll notice the amplifying effect it has on electricity and vibration. You get the resonance effect. It's the element of resonance because all particles within its form will take the same relative vibration when met with force over time. It serves as a vessel for force to penetrate and flow through softly. So alchemical processes take place within it, as it's designated as the medium for alchemical processes to take place within by the photon. It's the medium that it uses to merge things and produce new forms. So then we have earth. Earth is a solid. It represents addition. It is a stronger form, rigid, primordially feminine because it is a form. It, over time accepts things and will contain them within its form, but to be buried, entombed. It's matter in a solid state capable of expansion by construction. And it's densely packed particles that are limited or bound together by restriction to a crystalline form. Earth is matter in a form that accepts all things contained within it, to be held as true. It's a bit more resistant to change by the introduction of heat or passion or intensity. It doesn't vibrate as readily or carry vibration because it isn't as mutable as water. Obviously, it limits the resonance of what's introduced to it by force or passion. So it's used to establish foundation, integrity. Symbolically, archetypally, but also literally. It is what is used to set the value that we build ideas or structures upon. Earth is the denseness of material that permits for architecture and for matter to contain what is held to be valuable. So it's attributed to gods of law, restriction, punishment, authority. And depending on how your society is structured, that sort of thing can be considered as bad or restrictive, but it could also be considered as orderly. It could be a benevolent thing, where law is a necessity and people respect and they love the law. So it really depends. It could be considered a bad or good, but all things are divided by perspective, you see. So it could be, Earth represents obligation through restriction or being bound. It's denseness of form. It restricts the flow of light so that it's just, it's attributed to like gods of darkness and resistance, the rebellious ones like the devil, because when light attempts to penetrate it, unless there is an abundance of light and voltage, it stops it. It's the place where light doesn't penetrate. So it's like the underworld, the place furthest removed from God, furthest removed from the source. It's the matter. It's the gateway to the world of matter. 666, the carbon atom. And it represents material senses also, and you have in some disciplines of goddess worship where they attribute aspects of what and our contemporary religions would consider to be dark, or of Satan or the wicked one, we would attribute to the woman. Wickedness and her ability to lure the attention of man is seen as a vexing or manipulative thing. And she being form is, or also water is where man is drawn to seek his weakness, to relieve himself of weakness. So, there's a really a whole new idea system that we need to come up with to observe these things. And when we learn to view energy and or all things in terms of the archetypes and the elements they represent, we'll see a new side of what is good or bad, or what is masculine or feminine. So, you have where Earth represents the shadow, the scapegoat, where we see other particles and the illusion of that which binds us together but separates us from the truth. So you have people who are trapped in hell. Some people would see this place, the gateway to matter. We are in a material form and living subjectively, but secretly still attached to God through the photon. Some people would consider this hell. But then also, this is the material realm, where we party in the garden of earthly pleasures. So this is where the beauty of heaven, all the celestial frequencies and whatnot, gather to assume form in the shape of a vessel, which is innately feminine. All vessels are innately feminine, but that's a deeper mystique. So, in the Zodiac, we see also what gives us clues about the origin of the planets. It's speculated that as overlapping field, because there's speculation as to whether they are actually gods, but they being where the photon is assumed a form, and the photon being intelligent, it does follow an actual form of intelligence. These planets, they have an intellect that is alien to us, but they follow a law. But they are doing things essentially, and they engage in change and evolution. So they are subject to the vicissitudes of shifting, elemental forces, and they change their shape as a result. So they are essentially living creatures with an intelligence that extends beyond our spectrum of sight. So, in higher realms, we would notice maybe that the planets are actually tied to larger forms that extend far beyond our concept of space. They are, what's materializing in this realm to influence the atomic rhythm of things. But as they assumed form here, it's speculated that as overlapping fields of chaotic magnetic force from neighboring galaxies stabilized over hundreds or thousands of years, their influence might have given matter here, through torsion, its system of instructions, how it actually responds, how we move through these. It gave us the actual the maybe the frequency or the speed or the torsion. There's something about the photon that the archetypes influenced in our building, our creation, here in this solar system, in this matrix. So, the instructions for creating spherical forms, for instance, by way of torsion, they actually took on spherical forms. That may actually be why. They may actually be torsion fields that are overlapping, and we see the outside of them when it's apparently their apparent gravity is drawing them into their center, where the hypothetically all the torsion fields connect. I don't know. Perhaps Jupiter was stirred partially into nuclear fission by the urge of Sagittarius, because Sagittarius is where Jupiter is exalted, and we know Jupiter is a failed star. I hate to use the word failed, but perhaps it became exactly what it was intended to be, which was just voltage that would influence the voltage of the sun here and the network of the sun-moon matrix. That is the engine of the mind here in this system. Saturn, gathered dense materials. It represents restriction. Saturn is Capricorn. It's the lord of the gateway of matter. It represents the restrictive force of light. We know that both the houses of the zodiac and the functions of most planets bear a correlation, considering how they urge matter. So in the zodiac, we witness, by phase angles, the 12-fold breakdown of the bandwidth of light as it shows us the weaving torsional impact of photonic force smash through a receptive intermediary. As it shifts and coils, there's a change that seems to take place between the axis of pure force and then pure form and then pure force and then pure form, as in, it begins with Aries, but on the Aries axis you have Aries and Libra. That's air and that's fire and air. So you have fire and air, and then it moves to Taurus and Scorpio. That's earth and water, and then it moves to the third Gemini and Sagittarius, which is then air and fire, and then it moves to Cancer and Capricorn, I believe, and that is water and then earth. So it's like it's completing like this it's like it's knitting the two together, the force and the form, as if obeying some sort of rule of quadruplicity and equilibrium. So we use these axes to learn also certain truths about the dichotomy of perspective, the perspective of the photon through the shifting power struggle of the elements. So in Aries, you see, for instance, you have the point of origin, representative of the beginning of the atomic potential, therefore taking on sort of archetypal qualities of original force, source force, raw explosive material with a very warlike, focused and direct instinct to initiate whatever can be used for combustion. I'm sorry, not initiate, ignite, actually. That's a typo. And the behavior thereof is expressed by the photon. So on the axis of Aries is Libra, its direct opposite, which archetypally takes on qualities suggesting a perspective looking back on the self, Aries, as a reflection to the self of what we would assume to be either similar qualities or missing qualities. And so between Aries and Libra, we find the axis where the particle has established a sense of ego and relativity through relationships. So that actually goes in my work where I study the sigils also, and the signs, the sigils of the signs to discern hidden truths about their archetypes and about their influence, their hidden influence on nature through physics. They seem to cryptically provide some clue about the way the photon programs the physics of movement in this galaxy. The first thing I noticed about them is that they depict star clusters, or that we tend to highlight certain star clusters through them, which is, they're clusters of, other bodies that are intelligent. They're doing something. They're photonic forces. These bodies together, apparently, their power is so great it influences the physics of this solar system, and the mind, the way we evolve, and the perspective and the behavior of the photon. I believe they give us like a rate of spin. They tweak the rate of heat decay. It keeps a balance to the atomic rhythm. Maybe it keeps its motion, but I also notice they are markers also for our exact position in space. And I think I mentioned that a while ago, where, from our perspective, we get a sense of where we are relative to these other constellations. It's like maybe the key to a stargate, perhaps. It makes me wonder what the maps of other systems would look like. It just brings up so many questions. So I've also noticed that, their shapes are deliberate. Like even in the earliest phases of my studies, I noticed like the sigils they started speaking to me with their shapes. Like, I have a rudimentary understanding of physics with my work. For anyone who knows me, they know I'm a practicing HVAC technician, sort of a handyman. I did some work as a maintenance man, but I picked up a lot of this stuff pretty quickly, especially with my understanding of astrology. It just gave me a unique perspective in what the elements and particles, electricity is doing. So, in thermodynamics, you have certain shapes electricians use to communicate ideas to one another, and the idea of heat resistance is marked by the symbol of the ohm. The ohm, being a measurement of resistance, it's sort of cryptically displayed in Libra. You notice there's an ohm in Libra. The ohm being an expression of pressure of a form exerted against a descending force. So there's a natural force that is used or emitted by a form that is sort of the counter resistance to a force that gives it the resistance. It gives it the heat, the friction. I'm not sure what that's called, but I know there's an understanding of that in physics, but that like when there's impact, there is an equal and opposite impact, which is sort of like measured by the reaction. But that is all contained in the secret of the ohm. Excuse me. As a measurement of resistance. So it's like it's a pressure exerted against a descending pressure or an imposing pressure. So that's what it's depicting. And that's in Libra. And in Libra, you have this natural resistance between two people as they notice their polarity. And they are forced to engage one another. And there's this conflict as they sort things out through their relationship. And in relationships, we see the qualities that we contain, or the qualities about others that we perceive ourselves to be missing. We embody them through our relationship with others, or we engage others to learn about the qualities that we perceive ourselves to be missing, so that we can assume them for ourselves through internal work and become those qualities, embody them. And there's a natural conflict that takes place, which is the vicissitude that forces matter to engage itself, to evolve. It's the heat, the pressure that moves matter, urges it forward. Then you have the parallel circuit of Gemini, the explosive torsion field symbolism of the critical angle of Aries, which is like something being sucked down or being blasted up. You have the Pythagorean triangle hidden within Capricorn, which is also important to the water molecule, and it's the sacral grail that's the shape of a woman's uterus because of its reference to a cup or a container. The photon is not without a sense of irony. I'll attempt to break down each of these signs and add a new point of perspective relative to our use of the zodiac, because we, each of us, we carry the seat of consciousness of the photon within us. We are sort of snapshots of its manifold nature as it changes shape second by second. So too does its evolutionary potential change every second. We are we represent that. What each aspect of this thing as it changes its state are capable of creating. That's what it's interested in through us. So we each bear a portion of that potential as it seeks balance between its elements. So it's left to us to determine how to intelligently recalibrate, that force as we seek balance of the force and the form within us through our life experiences. We must each find a way to learn about our own energetic anatomy by the position of archetypal houses, the houses of heaven, and by the energy signatures of their material emissaries operating within us and through us, the planets. So, because of the irony of photons as being self-aware and as a dynamo, each to their own, of self-empowered energy, there's no limit to the number of forms it can assume for its expansion of consciousness. Every thought, every action, or rather every thought given action by intent produces a living matrix of the archetypes expressed by a temporal elemental homeostasis, in the form of a sine wave, rather. This is, and the lifetime of a sine wave is relative to itself, right? But this is also how manifestation works, because thoughts carry a subtle force. Force of any sort broadcasts a signal within one of the 12 planes of the matrix, or, the breakdown of its dimensions. So, with a strong enough frequency or resonance, it produces actual living constructs of the photon, spirits, and disembodied thought forms, which pervade the collective field with their own influence, where the archetypes play. So what you'll find in the deepest reaches of the occult is that all things are true on some level. And our perspective of them and engagement with them are what give them manifestation into physics with a strong enough resonance. The heavens play themselves out on Earth through frequencies. And what happens on Earth transmutes the nature of the photon in a material form by shifting the flow of its experience, the trajectory, the angle of its experience. And the power flows along currents to be released as pressure by paths of least resistance. This is how we train the great, or influence the great subconscious, the collective subconscious, how we impact it with our waves of intent. It collapses time through the awareness, and it collapses time, and therefore it collapses space. It collapses the distance between us and the culmination of our intent. So I want to go into the archetypes now. I'll actually begin with Aries and give you my breakdown of the archetypes, and my I don't know if it's a unique perspective, but I'll let you decide.